Has this ever happened to you? You're living a completely ordinary day, walking through a familiar place, listening to routine conversations, doing the same things as always, and suddenly a strange feeling comes over you, almost impossible to ignore. Everything seems too similar. The people, the environment, the weather, even the thoughts. For a few seconds, that silent impression arises that you've lived this exact moment before. Not in a vague way, but with an uncomfortable certainty, as if the present were repeating itself. Perhaps this happened at work, at home, in traffic, or even during a casual conversation. Nothing extraordinary was happening. Yet, something inside you pressed an invisible button and activated that feeling of, this isn't new. And the most curious thing is that, when you try to explain it rationally, you can't find any concrete memory. There's no clear memory, no specific episode, just the feeling. Have you ever experienced this? What makes this experience so intriguing is that it doesn't seem imagined. It seems real. Convincing. It's as if your brain is asserting something with complete certainty, even without presenting any evidence. And the more you try to ignore it, the more this impression draws your attention. It's not fear, it's not confusion, it's strangeness. A kind of silent discomfort that makes you question, even if only for a few seconds, your own perception of reality. Most people experience this and move on without stopping to reflect. After all, life goes on. But what if this feeling wasn't just a random detail? What if it revealed something much deeper about how the brain works, interprets the world, and creates internal certainties? What you're about to discover may surprise you, because this type of experience is neither rare nor a sign of something wrong. On the contrary, it's part of a very specific mechanism of the human mind. From an early age, we learn to trust our own brains. To trust what we feel, what we recognize, what seems familiar. The sensation of recognizing something is often associated with security, truth, and memory. But we rarely stop to think about where this certainty comes from. Does recognizing something necessarily mean remembering something? Or could the brain create this sensation for other reasons? Stay with me until the end of this reflection, because understanding this process completely changes how you see those strange everyday experiences. And more than that, it changes how you understand your own decisions, judgments, and inner certainties. Often, what seems like intuition is just the brain working on autopilot, using shortcuts to interpret the world quickly and efficiently. The curious thing is that these sensations tend to arise precisely in the most mundane moments, when nothing different is happening, when the mind is on autopilot. And perhaps this is no coincidence. Perhaps it is exactly in these moments that the brain feels freest to repeat patterns, compare situations, and create this impression of intense familiarity. Throughout this video, we'll go behind the scenes of this sensation. We'll understand why the brain swears it knows something that, rationally, never happened. We'll explore how subtle emotions, repeated patterns, and quick decisions blend to create an experience so real that it seems like absolute truth. It's not about flaws in the mind, but about how it was built to function. And as you listen to this, you might start to remember similar situations you've experienced. Moments when everything seemed too similar. When reality seemed to loop for a few seconds. Hold on to that feeling. It's the starting point for something much bigger. Because when we begin to observe these experiences more closely, we realize they reveal much more about the human mind than we imagine. And perhaps that's precisely why this type of conversation doesn't make sense in isolation. These strange sensations, these silent certainties that arise out of nowhere, almost everyone has experienced them, but few people talk about them aloud. So, if while you were listening to all this, if some memory came to mind, some personal experience made sense, leave a comment here about what touched you the most so far. It could be a specific situation, a feeling difficult to explain, or even a question that kept echoing. When you comment, you help other people realize they are not alone in these experiences. And if this content is helping you see these feelings in a new light, liking the video is a simple way to show that this kind of reflection matters. This helps the video reach more people who also go through these experiences but have never found words or explanations for them. That's how this conversation continues to spread. Now, if you feel you enjoy this type of content, calm, profound, curious, and not superficially addressing the human mind, subscribing to the channel is a way to continue this journey together. The idea here is precisely to explore these inner workings of the mind, without rushing, without ready-made answers, building understanding little by little. Your participation is what makes this space grow and allows more content like this to continue being created. And while you reflect on all of this, on these sensations that seem so real even when they don't make sense, stay with me, because now we're starting to delve into what really happens inside the brain when it creates this certainty of recognition that shouldn't exist. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a specific feeling that usually marks this phenomenon very clearly: the impression that the day is on replay. It's not just recognizing something isolated like a face or a place. It's something broader, more diffuse. It's when the entire routine seems like a copy of the previous one. The same routes, the same conversations, the same thoughts arising almost at the same time, as if time had lost its ability to surprise. Often this happens without you immediately realizing it. You wake up, start your day, complete tasks, answer messages, move from one place to another, and suddenly something catches your attention. A slight strangeness. A feeling that everything is excessively predictable. Not because you remember the previous day exactly, but because the present seems to fit perfectly into a pre-existing mold. As if the brain were simply running a familiar script. This is one of the most disconcerting experiences of false recognition applied to everyday life. There isn't a specific memory saying, "This already happened yesterday." What exists is a global feeling of repetition. An impression of familiarity so intense that it makes the present seem recycled. And this is usually accompanied by a silent question. Am I really experiencing something new or just going through another variation of the same day? Here's where a crucial element comes in: autopilot. The brain loves to operate in this mode. When the routine repeats itself, when the stimuli are similar, when there are no major novelties, it takes over completely. It automates movements, responses, decisions. This saves energy and keeps everything running efficiently. The problem is that, in this state, the perception of time and experience changes. When we're on autopilot, the brain stops registering details. It doesn't create rich, context-filled memories. It just executes. And when new details are lacking, the present begins to resemble the past. Not because it's identical, but because it was recorded in the same superficial way. That's when the strangeness arises. The feeling that the days are blurring together, that everything seems the same, that life is passing by in a loop. This experience is not a sign of mental weakness, lack of attention, or overactive imagination. It is a direct consequence of how the brain deals with repetition. The less novelty, the less effort it makes to differentiate moments. And the less differentiation, the greater the feeling of familiarity. The brain is not saying, "This has already happened." It is saying, "This is not different enough to warrant a new record." This detail changes everything. Because it transforms that uncomfortable feeling into something understandable. The day seems like a replay not because you're stuck in time, but because the brain is treating similar experiences as if they were the same thing. Behind the scenes, it groups, simplifies, and reduces. The conscious result of this is the feeling of repetition. And this feeling tends to appear more strongly during periods of emotional transition. Moments when life enters an overly automatic rhythm. When decisions are all predefined. When the mindset is focused only on completing tasks, not on living experiences. The brain enters maintenance mode. And in this mode, the world loses its nuances. It's curious to see how this affects the perception of the journey itself. Days that pass too quickly. Without clear milestones. Without emotional differentiation. When you look back, it seems like entire weeks blend together. Not because nothing happened, but because everything happened in the same way. The brain didn't find enough reasons to mark differences. This is one of the most revealing behind-the-scenes aspects of this phenomenon. False recognition doesn't just appear in strange events or isolated moments. It infiltrates routine. It shapes the perception of time. It influences how you perceive the passage of days. And the more automatic the process, the stronger this impression becomes. There's a hidden truth here that's rarely discussed. The brain doesn't register time, it registers change. When there's no perceptible change, time seems to disappear. The days become homogeneous blocks. And when you're living within those blocks, the present begins to feel recycled. Too familiar. Too known. This can generate a silent discomfort. A feeling of living in repetition mode without knowing exactly why. Some people describe it as boredom, others as mental fatigue, others as alienation. But at its core, it's the same experience. The mind isn't finding enough novelty to create differentiation. And here it's important to emphasize something. This is not imagination. It's not an exaggeration. It's not something that's just in your head, in a pejorative sense. It's in your head in the literal sense. It's part of the normal functioning of the brain, reacting to patterns, routines, and the absence of new stimuli. The mystery isn't in feeling it, but in not understanding where it comes from. When you start observing these moments more closely, you realize they don't appear out of nowhere. They emerge during specific phases of life. During periods of intense routine. At times when decisions are already automated. In phases where the mind is more concerned with keeping everything running than with exploring. This perception has a direct impact on how you relate to your own experience of living. It reveals that the feeling of replay is not a supernatural warning, but a psychological signal. A sign that the brain has entered maximum economy mode. A sign that the experience is being registered in a generic way without depth. And understanding this changes the game. Because it removes the weight of strangeness and opens up space for comprehension. The sensation remains intriguing, but it ceases to be threatening. It becomes a clue. A clue to how the mind is operating at that moment. To how experiences are being processed. And the more you understand this mechanism, the more you begin to realize that it doesn't act alone. It connects with emotion, attention, mental state, and even expectations. The brain doesn't function in isolation. It responds to both internal and external context. And it is precisely at this intersection that the phenomenon gains even more layers. Because if autopilot is capable of making entire days seem like copies of each other, this raises an even deeper question about how the brain creates the sensation of continuous reality. How does it decide what is new and what is merely repetition? How does it define what deserves to be remembered and what can be treated as more of the same? It is at this point that the mystery ceases to be merely a strange sensation and begins to approach something greater. Something that involves attention, awareness, and the way the mind constructs the experience of the present. And to understand this more clearly, it is necessary to observe how the brain reacts when certain internal states intensify and further alter this perception. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there is a silent trigger that connects all these sensations of repetition, strangeness, and excessive familiarity: stress. And here it's important to make something very clear from the beginning. When we talk about stress, we're not just talking about nervousness, obvious anxiety, or emotional crises. We're talking about a continuous, often invisible state that alters how the brain perceives the world without the person realizing it. Stress doesn't just affect emotions. It changes how the brain distributes attention, registers experiences, and perceives time. It affects novelty. It affects the depth with which moments are experienced. At constant, even moderate levels, stress pushes the brain into a more automatic, more defensive mode of functioning, and one that is much less sensitive to the details of the present. When the brain is under prolonged stress, it enters a state of extreme economy. Everything that is not essential becomes secondary. Focus narrows. Attention becomes fragmented. The mind concentrates on solving problems, surviving, maintaining control. And, in this process, the experience of the present moment loses richness. What remains is a sequence of actions performed, not moments lived. That's when the day starts to feel like a replay. Not because nothing is happening, but because the stressed brain isn't registering the differences. It goes through new experiences as if they were variations of something already known. There's no pause, no in-depth exploration, no genuine curiosity. Everything becomes a continuation. Everything becomes an extension of what came before. What's most intriguing is that many people live in this state without realizing they're stressed. There are no classic signs. Life is functioning. Tasks are being completed. Responsibilities are being met. But internally, the brain is operating in constant alert. A silent alert. A mode of vigilance that never completely shuts off. In this state, the brain prioritizes predictability. It looks for patterns. It tries to reduce surprises. And the more predictable something seems, the safer it feels. The problem is that this search for predictability transforms the new into something familiar even before it is truly experienced. The brain anticipates, completes, interprets too quickly. This profoundly alters the perception of time. Days pass quickly, without lasting impressions, without emotional differentiation. When you try to remember what you experienced, everything seems jumbled. Not because memory has failed, but because stress prevented experiences from being deeply registered. The brain was too busy trying to keep everything under control. This is one of the hidden truths of chronic stress. It doesn't scream, it numbs. It doesn't cause visible chaos, it creates internal monotony. And this monotony is the perfect breeding ground for false recognition and the feeling of repetition of reality. When the brain doesn't perceive novelty, it assumes familiarity. When it assumes familiarity, the feeling of "this has already happened" sets in. And understand how this affects your mindset. Life starts to feel mechanical. Decisions seem automatic. Choices are already made. There's no room for deep reflection, only execution. The stressed brain doesn't want to question. It wants to solve things quickly. And anything that's done too fast tends to feel like something that's already been done before. There's an emotional impact to this that isn't always easy to name. A feeling of detachment. A slight estrangement from one's own routine. As if you were physically present but mentally somewhere else. Stress creates this subtle disconnection, keeps the body in motion and the mind in restraint. And the longer this state lasts, the more the brain begins to treat reality as something predictable, almost repetitive. Not because it is, but because it has lost the ability to perceive it with freshness. Novelty hasn't disappeared from the world. It has disappeared from perception. This is a crucial point in the journey of understanding this phenomenon. The feeling of replay is not just a mental curiosity. It is a symptom of how the brain is dealing with constant pressure. A brain under stress doesn't explore, it manages. It doesn't observe, it reacts. And reacting continuously creates the illusion that everything is the same. The most curious thing is that, when stress decreases, these sensations tend to change. Moments become clearer. Time seems to slow down. Experiences regain their own shape. This shows that the problem was never in reality itself, but in the way it was being processed. This understanding brings about an important transformation. It removes the burden of the idea that something is wrong with you. It isn't. The brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do in situations of continuous pressure. It is trying to protect, simplify, and maintain stability. The cost of this is the loss of depth of experience. And when you understand this, you begin to realize that stress doesn't just create tiredness or irritation. It creates a specific way of seeing the world. A flatter, more repetitive, more predictable way. A way that favors false recognition, autopilot, and the feeling that life is running in the same cycles. This revelation changes the way we look at these strange experiences. They cease to be mere mysteries and become messages. Messages about how the mind is operating. About how attention is being used. About how much the brain is trapped in survival mode and detached from presence. And the more you observe how this works, the more you realize that this state doesn't appear overnight. It builds up gradually, behind the scenes, while life goes on seemingly normally. And that's precisely why it goes unnoticed for so long. Because a stressed brain functions well. It delivers results. It keeps everything afloat. But it exacts a silent price. The feeling of novelty, the vividness of the present, and the clarity of experience. And when that is lost, reality begins to seem like a repetition of itself. This understanding doesn't solve the mystery. On the contrary, it opens a new layer of reflection on how internal states completely shape what we call reality. Because if stress is capable of altering time, attention, and perception without you realizing it, this raises even deeper questions about other internal states that may also be shaping your experience right now. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when stress is prolonged, the brain not only changes how it perceives time or registers experiences, it changes mode. It enters a state of survival. And this detail explains much more than it seems at first glance. In survival mode, the brain is not interested in exploring, reflecting, or being enchanted. It wants to protect. It wants to keep everything functioning with the least possible expenditure of energy. It wants predictability. In this state, the priority ceases to be understanding the world in depth and becomes maintaining stability. The brain begins to make faster, less elaborate choices. It filters stimuli, ignores details, reduces nuances. Everything that doesn't seem essential is pushed to the back of consciousness. And what gains prominence? That which is already known. That which seems safe. That which requires no additional effort. That's why, under stress, the familiar becomes so dominant. The brain learns that the known represents less risk. The new demands attention, analysis, adaptation. The familiar allows for an automatic response. And when the mind enters this mode, it begins to value any sign of familiarity as if it were a safety anchor. It doesn't matter if this familiarity is real or just perceived. For the brain in survival mode, the sensation is enough. This mechanism is ancient. It has been shaped over thousands of years to cope with threat, scarcity, and uncertainty. When the environment seemed dangerous, overexploitation could be costly. Repeating known patterns increased the chances of survival. The problem is that, today, this same system is activated by modern pressures, deadlines, responsibilities, excessive stimuli, constant demands, that don't put life at risk but keep the brain in a state of continuous alert. The result is a hyperfunctional brain that is simultaneously impoverished in perception. It performs well, decides quickly, solves problems. But it does so by sacrificing present-day experience. Everything is treated as a variation of what has already been lived. The new never truly becomes new. It is quickly compared, fitted into, labeled. And when this happens repeatedly, the feeling of repetition sets in. In this state, the brain creates a kind of mental pathway. Decisions follow familiar paths. Interpretations are repeated. Emotional responses become predictable. The mindset enters maintenance mode. And the longer this mode remains active, the harder it becomes to perceive the difference between one day and another. Not because the days are the same, but because the brain has stopped treating them as unique experiences. There is a hidden truth here that changes how we understand these strange sensations. Repetition doesn't stem from reality, but from how it's being filtered. The brain in survival mode doesn't want novelty. It wants control. And control comes from predictability. Anything that deviates from that is softened, reduced, or ignored. This process also affects how you approach important decisions. In survival mode, the brain prefers the familiar, even if it's not the best. It chooses what seems safe, not what could be transformative. How many choices are made simply to avoid discomfort? How many opportunities are rejected because they would require stepping off the familiar path? False recognition acts here as a silent reinforcement. If something seems familiar, then it seems right. And this has a direct impact on one's personal journey. Life may continue to function perfectly on the outside, while internally a feeling of stagnation arises. Not because nothing is happening, but because everything is being processed in the same way. The brain doesn't differentiate. It groups. It reduces. It protects. In this state, even emotions begin to lose contrast. Joy, interest, and curiosity appear more timidly. Not because they have disappeared, but because the brain isn't giving them space to delve deeper. It's too busy maintaining balance. And when emotions lose intensity, experiences also lose their uniqueness. Everything starts to seem a little the same. This is one of the most important behind-the-scenes aspects to understanding why the day feels like a replay. It's not a memory lapse, nor an overactive imagination. It's a brain that has entered survival mode for too long. A brain that is doing what it does best to cope with constant pressure. Simplifying the world. The curious thing is that, in this mode, the brain also becomes less curious about the present. It already believes it knows what comes next. Anticipating is more efficient than observing. And when the mind constantly anticipates, it lives less in the now. It lives in projections. It lives in mental repetitions. It lives in compressed versions of reality. This realization brings about an important shift in mindset. It shows that the feeling of repetition is not a sign that life has lost its meaning, but that the brain is trapped in a state of protection. And excessive protection comes at a price. It reduces the ability to perceive nuance, novelty, and depth. When you understand this, you begin to look at these sensations with more kindness. Instead of fighting them or worrying about them, you start to see them as indicators. Indicators that the brain is prioritizing safety above all else. Indicators that perhaps it's time to observe how attention is being used, how stress is being absorbed, how the present experience is being lived. Because the brain in survival mode doesn't choose that state by chance. It responds to the environment, to demands, to pressures. It does the best it can with the resources available. The problem isn't entering that mode, but remaining in it without realizing it. And the longer one remains in this state, the more natural it seems. Repetition becomes normal. Autopilot becomes the norm. The initial strangeness disappears and gives way to a vague feeling of mental fatigue. It is only when someone stops and observes that they realize that something has changed in the way reality is being experienced. This understanding opens an important door to the next layer of this phenomenon. Because if the brain in survival mode favors the familiar and reduces the new, this means that certain internal states further amplify false recognition and the feeling of repetition. And understanding how these states intensify helps to understand why, at some points in life, this feeling becomes much more frequent than at others. Comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there's a crucial detail that explains why, at certain periods in life, everything starts to seem the same. The brain simply reduces its sense of novelty. And this doesn't happen due to carelessness, laziness, or lack of interest. It happens because, under continuous stress, attention changes its function. It stops exploring and starts conserving energy. The brain doesn't perceive the world neutrally. It perceives what it's paying attention to. And attention is a limited resource. When stress sets in, much of that attention is diverted to monitoring risks, completing tasks, anticipating problems, and maintaining control. Very little space is left to observe subtle details of the environment, of people, and even of oneself. And it is precisely these details that give experiences a sense of novelty. When fewer details are recorded, the brain creates more generic records. It doesn't capture small variations in tone, expression, environment, or emotion. It records the big package of the experience. And when several days are recorded in this generic way, they begin to overlap in memory. Not because they were the same, but because they were perceived in the same way. This is one of the most important behind-the-scenes aspects of the phenomenon. The feeling of repetition doesn't arise because life has stopped changing, but because the brain has stopped noticing the changes. Reality continues to vary, but the stressed mind isn't keeping up with these variations with the necessary attention. The new goes unnoticed. The different doesn't stand out. Everything falls into the same mental category. It's like listening to music at a very low volume. The notes are still there, but you don't perceive the details. Over time, several different songs start to sound similar. Not because they are the same, but because you're not listening attentively enough to distinguish them. The brain works the same way when stress reduces perceptual focus. In everyday life, this manifests itself in very clear ways. Conversations seem the same. Workdays blend together. Routes traveled daily lose their identity. Even emotions begin to seem repetitive. There is no clear marker saying, "This day was different." And without markers, memory doesn't create separation. Everything becomes continuous. There is a hidden truth in this process that completely changes how we understand these sensations. Novelty is not something that simply exists in the world. It is something that needs to be perceived. And perception requires attention. When attention is compromised, novelty disappears. Not from reality but from subjective experience. The stressed brain does this as a strategy. Reducing attention to detail is a way to speed up responses and decrease overload. It decides that it's not worth spending energy analyzing what already seems familiar. The problem is that this seeming familiar arises precisely because the analysis was superficial. It's a silent, self-reinforcing cycle. This mechanism also explains why, during lighter periods of life, everything seems more vivid. Small events gain meaning. An ordinary day becomes memorable. Time seems longer. This doesn't happen because life has changed drastically, but because attention was more available. The brain was registering details, creating differentiation, building unique experiences. Under stress, the opposite happens. The mindset goes into compression mode. The experience of the world is compressed. The brain begins to treat different situations as variations on the same theme. And when this repeats itself for days or weeks, the unsettling feeling arises that everything is happening again. This switching off of the sense of novelty is not total. It is selective. The brain remains attentive to what it considers relevant for immediate survival: problems, deadlines, threats, obligations. But it becomes almost blind to that which does not require immediate action. Beauty, curiosity, subtlety, presence, all of this loses priority. And here's a key point in understanding this phenomenon. The feeling of replaying isn't an isolated cognitive error. It's a side effect of a brain that's been operating in protective mode for too long. A brain that's using attention as a defense mechanism, not an exploration tool. When you understand this, something changes internally. The strangeness begins to make sense. That feeling of, the days are passing the same way, ceases to seem like a personal mystery and begins to be understood as a specific mental state. A state in which the mind is functional, efficient, productive, but disconnected from the richness of the present. This understanding also reveals why these sensations often arise even when life is seemingly normal. You don't need to be in crisis for the brain to reduce its attention. A constant accumulation of demands, decisions, and responsibilities is enough. Stress doesn't need to be intense, it just needs to be continuous. And the longer the brain spends registering experiences superficially, the harder it becomes to spontaneously recover the feeling of novelty. Not because it's lost forever, but because the brain has become accustomed to not seeking it out. It has learned that it's not a priority. This is a delicate and profound point. Because it shows that the feeling of repetition is not a sign that something is wrong with you, but a sign of how your attention is being used. It shows that the mind is not broken, just adapted to a context that demands constant survival. And this raises an important question that lingers. If the brain is capable of switching off the sense of novelty to conserve energy, what happens when this conservation becomes the norm? How does this impact the way you perceive your own life, your decisions, your feelings, and your journey over time? These questions don't demand immediate answers. They demand observation. Because when you begin to understand how attention shapes experience, you start to see these sensations not as flaws, but as signals. Signals from a brain that is trying to protect itself, even if it costs the vividness of the present moment. And it is precisely from this understanding that space opens up to look even deeper into how specific internal states alter the way reality is constructed by the mind, not only in stress but at other times when perception changes without us realizing it. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a central link connecting everything we've discussed so far: the direct relationship between stress, memory, and perception. It's at this point that the phenomenon ceases to seem like just a strange sensation and begins to reveal a very specific functioning of the brain. When stress sets in, it doesn't just change mood or energy levels. It alters how memories are stored and, most importantly, how they are accessed later. Memory is not a neutral file stored in a drawer. It is an active process. For something to be remembered as new, different, and unique, the brain needs to register details. Context, emotion, sequence, meaning. This registration requires available attention. It requires presence. It requires a brain relatively open to experience. Under stress, this openness decreases drastically. When the brain is overloaded, it starts recording less new information. Not because it can't, but because it decides it's not worth the cost. Instead of richly registering the present, it uses existing structures. Old patterns. Familiar pathways. It's as if, faced with constant pressure, the brain says, I've seen something like this before, so I'll use the same mold. This reuse of patterns is efficient, but it has a powerful side effect. The present begins to seem like a repetition of the past. Not because it is identical, but because it is being processed with the same filters. Memory doesn't create a new file, it only updates an old one. And when this happens repeatedly, the feeling of novelty disappears. This is one of the most important behind-the-scenes aspects of this phenomenon. The stressed brain doesn't create rich memories. It creates compressed memories. Generic records without many internal differences. And when you try to remember what you've experienced, everything seems similar. The days blur together. Experiences overlap. The mind looks back and finds no clear points of separation. The curious thing is that, at the moment this happens, almost no one notices. The person continues living, making decisions, interacting, producing. Everything seems normal. But, inside, memory is being built in a way that is far too economical. And this economy exacts a silent price, the loss of the feeling of the uniqueness of the present. There is a hidden truth here that completely changes the understanding of this state. Memory is not just for remembering the past. It serves to give identity to the present. When the brain doesn't properly register the present loses its shape. And when the present loses its shape, it begins to resemble any other moment already lived. Stress also interferes with memory retrieval. When you try to access recent memories, the brain resorts to older references because they are more consolidated. New experiences, poorly registered, remain diffuse. So, in the absence of fresh details, the mind fills in with what it already knows. Once again, the past invades the present. This mechanism creates a very specific sensation, that you have already experienced it before. Not as a clear flash, but as a diffuse recognition. The brain is not remembering something specific. It is reusing an old structure to interpret something new. And this generates the illusion of repetition. This profoundly affects one's perception of the journey itself. Life begins to seem less progressive and more circular. Decisions seem like versions of old ones. Conversations sound too familiar. Days seem to vary only in superficial details. Not because there is no change, but because memory is not registering these changes clearly enough. This process also shapes mindset. When everything seems repetitive, a feeling of internal stagnation arises. A weariness that doesn't come from the body but from the mind. The person may even be progressing but doesn't feel like they're making progress. They may be experiencing new things but don't feel novelty. The brain is using the past as a lens for everything. It's important to emphasize that this doesn't happen because the brain failed. It happens because it's trying to protect itself. Under stress, the priority is maintaining function, not enriching experience. The brain chooses stability over depth. And stability comes from repeating already known patterns. This understanding brings important relief. It shows that this feeling of replaying is not a sign that life has lost its meaning, nor that something is wrong with you. It is a sign that the brain has entered a specific processing mode, where the new is treated as a variation of the old. And the longer this mode remains active, the more natural it seems. The mind gets used to functioning this way. Perception adjusts. Repetition becomes the norm. Only when someone stops and observes carefully do they realize that something has changed in the way reality is being experienced. This relationship between stress, memory, and perception also explains why, in moments of emotional relief, everything seems to regain its color. An ordinary day becomes more memorable. Small experiences stand out. Time seems to slow down. This happens because the brain starts registering details again, creating richer memories and differentiating experiences. The contrast is revealing. It shows that external reality hasn't changed as much as the way we register it. The difference lies in the internal state. In the availability of attention. in the freedom of the mind to observe instead of just reacting. This point is crucial for understanding the real impact of continuous stress. It doesn't just tire you out. It homogenizes experience. It transforms different days into similar memories. It makes the brain reuse the past to save energy in the present. And when you understand this, you begin to perceive these sensations as signs of functioning, not as malfunctions. Signs that the mind is operating in containment mode. Signs that the brain is prioritizing safety over exploration. This perception opens the door to even deeper reflection on how other internal states, beyond stress, can influence the way reality is constructed by the mind. Because if the brain is capable of making the present seem like a repetition simply by changing the way it records memories, this suggests that what we call reality is much more malleable than we usually admit. And this malleability is not something distant or theoretical. It is happening now, with every experience, every decision, every moment the brain chooses to deeply register or simply reuse an old pattern to move forward. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there's a clear pattern when we observe who experiences this type of feeling more frequently. And it points to adulthood. Not by chance. Adults under constant pressure tend to experience this feeling of repetition, excessive familiarity, and estrangement from the present much more than children or adolescents. This is not a coincidence, nor is it individual fragility. It's a direct consequence of their way of life. During childhood and adolescence, the brain lives in a very different state. There is constant novelty, frequent changes, almost daily discoveries. The environment changes, experiences multiply, the body grows, emotions are intense and new. The brain is constantly stimulated to register differences. It needs to learn, explore, test. Attention is naturally turned outward, curious, open to the unexpected. That's why the days seem long, full of details, marked by unique events. In adulthood, the logic is reversed. Routine sets in. Responsibilities accumulate. The brain begins to operate under constant demands. Work, financial decisions, relationships, expectations, deadlines, internal and external pressures. Even when everything seems to be under control, the mind is occupied. Planning, solving, anticipating. This continuous state of functioning creates mental overload. And it is precisely this overload that intensifies the phenomenon we are exploring. The adult brain, pressured by multiple responsibilities, more easily enters automatic modes. It learns that repeating known patterns is more efficient than analyzing everything from scratch. Every decision saved is energy preserved. Every routine maintained is one less risk. The problem is that this efficiency has a perceived cost. Over time, adult life begins to be lived in blocks. Weekdays blend together. Weeks pass by too quickly. Months seem compressed. Not because nothing happened, but because the brain didn't register enough differences between events. Everything was processed with the same filters, the same priorities, the same mental state. The resulting memory is homogeneous. This is a crucial point of identification for viewers. Many adults feel that time is slipping away, that the days are all the same, that life is passing by too quickly. And this feeling is usually accompanied by a sense of strangeness, not explicit boredom. A kind of silent discomfort difficult to explain. As if something were being experienced automatically. The hidden truth here is that the adult brain rarely has room to rest its attention on the present. It is almost always oriented towards what comes next. The next task. The next decision. The next problem to solve. And when attention is always on the immediate future, the present loses depth. It ceases to be lived and becomes merely traversed. This explains why children rarely report this type of sensation. They live in the present moment. Even in repeated situations, their perspective changes, their emotions change, the experience is new. The child's brain isn't concerned with keeping everything functioning. It's busy discovering. The adult brain, on the other hand, is busy sustaining. And the heavier the support becomes, the more the brain resorts to what it already knows. Routines, habits, already established mental pathways. False recognition finds fertile ground in this scenario. When everything is processed quickly based on old patterns, the new loses space to emerge as new. It is interpreted as a variation of the known. This dynamic also affects mindset. Adults begin to believe that they've seen it all, that nothing changes, that it's always the same thing. Not because this is true, but because the brain is using old models to interpret current experiences. Life continues to offer variations, but the mind is not available to perceive them clearly. There is also an important emotional factor. Adults tend to carry persistent worries. Even during moments of rest, the mind remains active. Thoughts return. Unresolved issues take up space. This further fragments attention. And fragmented attention registers poorly. Weak memory generates a feeling of repetition. This cycle reinforces itself over time. The more responsibilities, the more stress. The more stress, the less novelty is perceived. The less novelty, the more the present resembles the past. And the more the present seems repetitive, the more adult life takes on this strange feeling of always living the same day with minor variations. It's important to understand that this isn't a flaw of adult life. It's an adaptation. The adult brain becomes extremely efficient at handling complexity. It learns to function even under constant pressure. It delivers results. It keeps everything afloat. But, to do so, it sacrifices perceptual depth. This understanding brings a powerful shift in perspective. It shows that the feeling of repetition doesn't mean your life has lost value or meaning. It means your brain is working too hard to keep everything running. It's prioritizing modern survival, financial, social, emotional, above the full experience of the present. When this logic becomes clear, something interesting emerges. The feeling of replay ceases to be merely an annoyance and becomes a signal. An indicator of how the mind is operating. A direct reflection of the mental overload typical of adult life. And this signal doesn't ask for guilt, it asks for understanding. Because if this phenomenon is more common in adulthood, it also means that it is deeply linked to choices, contexts, and internal states. It doesn't arise from nothing. It builds up over time, behind the scenes, as life continues to demand more and more attention, energy, and decisions. And when you start to observe this, you realize that this feeling doesn't appear all the time. It arises in specific phases. During periods of greater pressure. During moments of intense routine. In phases where the brain is more focused on maintaining balance than on exploring possibilities. This perception opens the door to even deeper reflection on how the adult brain can alternate between modes of functioning, sometimes more automatic, sometimes more present, and how this directly influences the experience of reality. Because if adult life favors this state of repetition, understanding how it is formed is the first step to seeing other layers of this phenomenon. And it is precisely from here that the conversation begins to touch on something even more subtle. How small, almost imperceptible internal changes can completely alter the way the brain interprets the present and constructs the sensation of experiencing something new or simply repeating what has already happened. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there comes a point when this feeling of repetition stops being merely curious and starts to carry a different meaning. It's not fear, it's not alarm, it's not something urgent in a dramatic sense. It's more subtle than that. It's when repetition begins to function as a silent warning signal. A discreet warning from the body and brain saying that something needs attention. When the day feels like an occasional replay, it might just be the brain conserving energy. But when this feeling becomes frequent, persistent, almost a constant backdrop to life, it's worth stopping and observing more carefully. Not to be alarmed, but to understand. The brain doesn't send signals for no reason. It communicates in the way it can, often through sensations that are difficult to name. Constant repetition often arises when the internal system has been operating at its limit for too long. Not at the point of collapse, but at the limit of continuous adaptation. The body continues to function, the mind continues to solve problems, life goes on. But something begins to lose quality in the process. The ability to feel novelty, presence, and real engagement with the present moment. This is the point where repetition ceases to be merely a side effect of routine and becomes a request for adjustment. A request for a pause, for recovery, or for change. Not necessarily a radical change, but a change of pace, of focus, or of relationship with what is being experienced. When the brain remains in survival mode for too long, it begins to signal perceptual fatigue. It doesn't do this with immediate physical pain. It does it with numbness, with a feeling of detachment, with the impression that everything is the same. This, everything is the same, is an elegant way of saying, I'm not able to process everything in depth. It's important to understand that this sign doesn't mean something is wrong with you. On the contrary, it shows that the body is trying to conserve resources. It's trying to avoid further wear and tear. The repetition appears as a containment strategy, not as a defect. When this signal is ignored for too long, the brain tends to reinforce shortcuts even more. It automates even further. It further reduces attention to detail. And this creates a silent cycle. The less novelty perceived, the more repetition felt. The more repetition felt, the less emotional involvement with the present. And the less involvement, the harder it becomes to realize when something needs to change. This cycle can impact important decisions without the person realizing it. Choices begin to be made out of inertia. Paths are maintained because they seem familiar, not because they still make sense. The mindset adjusts to repetition as if it were the natural state of things. And this can generate a vague feeling of dissatisfaction, even when everything seems in order. Here's a delicate but necessary point. Persistent repetition is not a warning of imminent danger. It's an invitation to reflect. An invitation to observe the relationship between effort and recovery, between demand and rest, between doing and feeling. The body and brain need cycles. Cycles of activation and pause. Cycles of focus and healthy distraction. When these cycles are interrupted by long periods of continuous demand, the system adapts as best it can. And this adaptation has a very clear perceptual signature. Everything starts to look the same. This is the kind of warning that doesn't call for urgency, it calls for listening. It doesn't call for panic, it calls for attention. It emerges to signal that the current way of functioning is costing us something important. The vividness of experience. The feeling of being truly present in one's own life. Many people interpret this signal as boredom, lack of motivation, or even a loss of meaning. But most of the time that's not it. It's perceived fatigue. It's accumulated mental overload. It's the brain saying it needs space to register new information again. And this space doesn't appear automatically. It arises when something changes in the rhythm, attention, or way of relating to one's own experiences. Sometimes, it's enough to interrupt the continuous flow of demands. Sometimes it's necessary to review priorities. Sometimes the body asks for rest while the mind still insists on moving forward. The most important thing is to understand that this signal is not the end of the line. It's an adjustment point. A chance to realize that repetition is not life itself, but the way it is being processed. And ways of processing can change. This understanding brings a different kind of responsibility. Not the heavy, demanding kind, but a gentle responsibility. The responsibility of observing one's own internal state. The responsibility of recognizing when survival mode has been active for too long. The responsibility of allowing small pauses before the body needs to scream louder. When repetition becomes a warning sign, it invites a silent transformation. A change of mindset that begins with perception. With the ability to notice what is being felt without trying to solve everything immediately. Just to notice. And upon noticing, something begins to reorganize itself. Attention gains small openings. The present begins to recover nuances. The feeling of novelty doesn't return all at once, but gradually. Because the brain, when it feels safer, begins to explore again. It begins to register details again. It begins to differentiate experiences again. This is a process, not an on-off switch. And recognizing the signal is the first step on this journey. A journey that's not about escaping routine, but about inhabiting routine in a different way. With less automatism and more awareness. And all of this sets the stage for a question that hangs in the air. If repetition can be a silent warning from the brain asking for adjustment, how is it possible to perceive this signal in time, before it becomes the permanent backdrop of the experience? Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because after understanding how the cycle of repetition forms, another question naturally arises. What helps the brain break free from it? And the answer isn't in major disruptions, radical changes, or dramatic decisions. Most of the time, what truly breaks the cycle are small, conscious, and consistent adjustments, simple changes that give the brain something it was missing out on. Real novelty. The brain doesn't need something extraordinary to break out of repetition mode. It needs perceived difference. It needs small deviations from the pattern. When everything always happens the same way, at the same pace and with the same level of attention, the brain concludes that there is nothing new to register. But when a detail changes, even a subtle one, the mind awakens. It starts observing again. It starts comparing again. It starts registering again. One of the simplest ways to do this is to break micro-routines. Not the entire routine but small sections of it. Walking a slightly different route. Changing the order of a daily activity. Altering the work environment for a few hours. These gestures seem insignificant, but to the brain they are clear signals of novelty. They say, pay attention, this isn't exactly the same. Another essential point is the conscious pause. Not the kind of pause where the body stops but the mind keeps racing. But real pauses, even brief ones, where attention is withdrawn from problem solving and brought back to the immediate experience. The brain needs these intervals to switch from survival mode to integration mode. Without a pause, it simply executes. With a pause, it processes. Mental rest also plays a central role. It's not just about sleeping more, although sleep is fundamental. It's about reducing the excess of constant stimuli. Too much information, too many notifications, too many decisions. When the brain is saturated, it cannot perceive novelty even when it is present. Reducing the volume is a way to restore sensitivity to perception. Mindfulness comes in here as a powerful ally, not as a rigid technique but as a posture. Mindfulness is not about emptying the mind, it's about noticing. Noticing the environment, the body, the breath, the thoughts without trying to correct them immediately. This act of noticing restores the brain's ability to register details. And details are the raw material of novelty. When attention returns to the present, even for a few minutes, something changes in the way the experience is registered. The brain switches off autopilot and enters observation mode. It begins to create richer memories again. And when memories become richer, the days stop blending together so much. The feeling of repetition begins to lose its power. It's important to understand that the brain doesn't exit repetition mode all at once. It alternates between them. A little presence here, a little automatism there. And that's natural. The goal isn't to eliminate autopilot, but to prevent it from becoming the only mode of operation. Another simple yet powerful element is emotional rest. Often, the mind is tired not because it works too hard but because it demands too much of itself. High expectations, constant self-criticism, a feeling of always being in debt, all of this keeps the brain on high alert. When this pressure decreases even slightly, perception expands. The world regains its clarity. These approaches don't promise instant transformation, and that's important to say. What they offer is something more realistic, gradually reintroducing the feeling of difference into everyday experience. And this, over time, profoundly alters how the brain perceives reality. When the brain begins to encounter novelty again, it stops reusing old patterns so much. It starts creating new records. The present separates itself from the past once more. Life ceases to seem like a continuous replay and begins to be perceived as a sequence of distinct, albeit simple, moments. This process also changes one's mindset. The feeling of internal stagnation gives way to a more vivid perception of one's own journey. The journey ceases to seem like a closed cycle and begins to be felt as something in motion. Not because everything has changed but because the way of perceiving has changed. There's an important truth here. The brain doesn't switch out of repetition mode just because you tell it to. It switches out when it feels safe enough to explore again. And safety, in this context, comes from pauses, rest, and enough predictability so that it doesn't need to be constantly on alert. When that happens, curiosity returns naturally. And perhaps the most beautiful aspect of this process is realizing that the brain wants to break free from the cycle. It's not trapped by stubbornness. It's trapped for protection. When it realizes it can lower its guard, it goes back to doing what it does best. Learning, differentiating, creating new meaning. All of this shows that repetition is not a permanent state, but a sign that something needs to be adjusted in the way life is being lived and perceived. Small changes are enough to start this transformation. It's not about changing who you are, but about changing how you inhabit what is already part of your life. And as these adjustments happen, even if slowly, the brain begins to move out of maximum energy-saving mode. It starts investing energy in the experience again. It begins to see the present moment as something worthy of being recorded more carefully. This understanding sets the stage for looking even deeper into how these internal changes impact not only the perception of time and routine, but also how you recognize yourself within your own story. Because when experience becomes new again, identity also begins to reorganize itself. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because after going through all these layers, stress, memory, perception, routine, survival, something starts to become clear in an almost inevitable way. Reality itself isn't actually repeating itself. The world hasn't gone into a loop. What has changed is the filter. It's the way the brain has started to organize, prioritize, and interpret what reaches it. When stress accumulates, when attention becomes fragmented, when life demands constant responses, the brain does what it knows how to do to keep everything running. It simplifies. It narrows the field of vision. It reduces sensitivity to detail. It reuses old patterns to cope with the present. And, in this process, the experience of the now loses depth. Not because the present is poor, but because it is being interpreted with a limited mental vocabulary. That's why the feeling of repetition is so compelling. It doesn't come as a rational idea, it comes as a bodily, emotional, almost intuitive impression. Feels like a felt truth. But this truth doesn't arise from external facts. It arises from the way the brain, under pressure, is filtering the world. Reality continues to change, but the mind has stopped keeping up with these changes with the same openness as before. This perception completely changes the tone of the experience. Instead of something strange or frightening, repetition comes to be understood as a state, a specific mental state, a way of functioning. Not permanent, not definitive, but profoundly influential while it is active. And states can change. There's something powerful about realizing this, because it takes the weight off the idea that life has become this way, or that something is lost forever. Nothing is lost. The brain has simply entered a mode of economy, protection, and predictability. A mode that makes sense in certain contexts, but which exacts a price when it becomes continuous. This understanding also invites a different kind of responsibility. Not that heavy responsibility full of demands, but a responsibility of observation. The ability to notice when the experience starts to become too flat. When the days start to blend together. When the present starts to seem like an automatic variation of the past. These are not signs of personal failure. They are signs of adaptation. Signs that the brain is working hard to cope with everything. And, at the same time, signs that perhaps it needs to give back to it what has been relegated to the background. Pause, attention, real novelty, mental rest. The real transformation here isn't about fighting the brain, but about understanding its inner workings. It's about recognizing that the brain doesn't lie out of malice. It constructs habitable versions of reality, versions that allow it to continue functioning even under pressure. The problem isn't this construction. The problem is forgetting that it's a construction. When you remember this, something changes in your relationship with your own sensations. The strangeness ceases to be an enemy and becomes a clue. An invitation to curiosity. A reminder that the experience of reality is dynamic, constantly shaped by internal states that often go unnoticed. And perhaps that's the most fascinating point of all. The fact that the feeling of repetition, which seems to take something away from life, can actually give back something very important. Awareness. Awareness of how the mind operates, of how stress shapes perception, of how small internal changes profoundly alter the way the world is felt. None of this requires immediate answers. It doesn't ask for quick solutions. It only asks for enough presence to notice, to perceive when the brain is filtering too much, to understand that if everything seems the same, perhaps it's not because the world has become poorer, but because the mind is too tired to see its variations. And this leaves an open question, one that doesn't need to be answered now, but deserves to be echoed. If the reality you feel depends so much on the internal state of your brain, how many other experiences in your life might be being interpreted differently without you realizing it? Comment below, that makes sense to me. If you've made it this far, it's because this conversation truly resonated with you. It's not light content in a superficial sense, but it's light in the way it looks at the mind with curiosity, without judgment. If this video helped you better understand these strange sensations, to see repetition more clearly and with less guilt, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to continue following this type of reflection on the brain, perception, and those silent inner workings of the mind that almost no one explains calmly. If you've ever thought, "This has happened to me before," leave a comment writing, "I'm with you until the end," or "This message was for me." These comments show that this conversation didn't end here and help create a space where other people can also recognize themselves in these experiences. And if, throughout the video, you felt that silent connection, that click of understanding, liking the video is just a natural way to signal that. It's not an obligation, it's an exchange. It's what allows content like this to continue reaching those who need to hear this type of explanation. Now, there's a video over here that perfectly complements this topic and delves even deeper into this mystery of the brain and the perception of reality. Click there and continue watching.